Presbyterians for Earth Care. So grateful you all are with us. I'm going to open us with a poem by Steve Garnis Holmes, who is a retired Methodist minister and does poetry based on the lectionary, and I love his work. Tell you a little bit about Presbyterians for Earth Care, and then turn things over to Emma, who's going to talk about Canopy. So Steve's poem is based on the scripture from Corinthians 12:13. In the one spirit, we were all baptized into one body. And then he writes, of course, we don't believe that. We think we're separate. We thank God we don't live in that war zone, as if we don't. As if those who live in there are not us, not our flesh and blood. And so their suffering is less real than ours. It comes naturally to assume that the stranger is not part of us, that the grief of a distant tribe is not ours, that the lake on the tundra has nothing to do with the flow of our blood. It is our life's work to overcome this delusion, to live in the spirit in which we are one, rather than by the flesh by which we seem to be separated. If claiming the suffering of the whole world seems too wearisome, too much grief for one person to take on, that is because we still believe we're one person, one small individual. But when we know we are one with all, we trust that all the world's evil and suffering is easily borne and absorbed by the infinite joy and beauty of the whole, the very heart of God. So that's Steve Garnis Holmes. And I like the idea of us being a community. And here we are. And so just a bit about Presbyterians for Earth Care, especially for those who are joining us maybe for the first time. The thing that we work to do is connect, equip, and inspire. 36 years ago in 1990, the 202nd General Assembly adopted by a resounding 97% majority a policy report entitled Restoring Creation for Ecology and Justice. 5 years after that, Presbyterians were restless to see what that policy meant in flesh, and they founded Presbyterians for Restoring Creation, which was a national grassroots organization to support people of faith who are working toward environmental wholeness and social justice. That has since become Presbyterians for Earth Care. So for the last 2 decades, we've connected members through this network, seeking to keep the sacred at the center of Earth Care, advocacy, and action, both inside and outside the walls of the church. We equip members with resources, ideas, and information for shared journey toward a healthier planet through things like our webinars, which happen monthly, our quarterly Earth blog, and other events. We inspire members through stories from individuals and groups that have responded to the sacred call to care for the earth. Stories told person to person at events and by newsletter, email, social media, and devotions. So that's just a window into Presbyterians for Earth Care. And it's hard these days to focus on one thing, but the one thing that we focus on is creation care. And we're grateful for everybody in our orbit who takes that up. And so now I'm going to introduce Emma, who is our coordinator for Canopy, which is our new young adult initiative. Emma.
Thanks, Courtney. Hi, everyone. It's so good to see you all. Thank you all so much for being here. I will just take a brief moment to let you all know a little bit about Canopy. That stands for the Creation Action Network of Presbyterian Young Adults, if you don't think about it too hard. And we are we're about a year old. We're coming up on a year. We are a group of 18 to 35-year-olds, Presbyterians and their friends, but we are not carding on either of those things. And we gather together to do advocacy and activism in pursuit of creation justice and in solidarity with creation. This space exists because we know that creation justice and the climate crisis are sort of uniquely live issues for young adults. And also because we want to encourage and empower young adults to step up and take leadership in the denomination and use their voices and speak into this space that is ours as much as it is anyone's. And so we gather once a month on Zoom for a more structured hour. We also gather for a more informal hour once a month. We keep in touch online on Instagram. We also have a WhatsApp space that folks can join. And we are working on building an issue agenda within the church around creation care and environmental justice. If that is something that you or someone you love would be interested in, you can find us on PEC's website. You can also find us, I'll put the link in the chat, but at canopy_PEC on Instagram, and that's where all of our links live. So that's us. But mostly, I want to use my time to introduce our moderator for the evening, Drew Hill. So Drew you can see him on your screen there, and he will be leading us this evening. Drew was raised in the community of First Presbyterian Church Santa Fe and served as a YAV in Washington, D.C., and he went on to a bachelor's in philosophy at the University of New Mexico, and then served as a young adult advisory delegate to the previous General Assembly. So he's basically Presbyterian royalty. He has worked as a district staffer for a New Mexico congressman until recently transitioning out of the office to pursue a law degree at UNM's School of Law for the upcoming fall. So congrats to Drew. And he is a member of Canopy's steering committee and our general membership. And it is under his leadership that this event came together. So he is going to be leading us through the evening. So Drew, with that, I will hand it over to you.
Well, thank you so much, Emma, and thank you, Courtney, and thank you to all the candidates for being here this evening. We really appreciate this opportunity. I'm really excited that this conversation can be a great opportunity for commissioners, advisory delegates, and everyone here today to get to hear everyone's vision for leadership in the future of the church. Before we get into it, a brief rundown on the format. There will be two sets of questions. The first being predetermined questions that have been shared with the candidates, and each pair will have about 2 minutes to answer those questions, splitting the time as they see fit. And then we will have a second set of questions that are chosen by you, the audience, and you can submit and vote on questions. We're doing this via a platform, Emma's posted that link in the chat, and I will share briefly a QR code if you want to scan it with your phone if you want to submit those as well. And so those questions, just submit them and you can vote on the ones that you most want to hear answered. And the three questions that get the most votes, we'll make sure to get those answered at the end, just because we'll be pretty limited on time. But thank you all for being here. And with that said, I would like to end my screen share. I would like to introduce all the candidates in no particular order, but first we have Reverend Rebecca Luter and Chris Peters, bringing deep pastoral experience, creativity, and a shared commitment to God's work in the world. Rebecca, pastor of Farmington Presbyterian Church, has more than 2 decades of ministry experience in congregational revitalization, strategic leadership, public service, and administration, shaped by resilience as a 2-time breast cancer survivor, wife, and mother of artists. Chris, senior pastor of Westminster Presbyterian in Lincoln, Nebraska, serves a certified Earth Care congregation and brings a ministry grounded in gratitude for God's grace and creation. With leadership at Montreat and Massanetta, PDA Relief, and Guatemala partnership trips, and life as a husband, father, and dog owner. Rebecca, our second pair, Rebecca Marta Pomeroy Cordero, is a PCUSA minister on the border in El Paso, Texas. Her role with Tres Rios is to connect PCUSA congregations to the border, to work for narrative change, system change, and personal change, and to provide direct support in the areas that are needed the most as systems shift. Reverend Dr. Chris Schaudenmeyer is a husband, father of 4, and pastor of First Presbyterian Church of Davenport, Iowa. He holds a doctorate focused on religion and public policy, previously served as 2025 moderator of his presbytery and on the PCUSA's Survivors of Sexual Misconduct Task Force. Our third pair, Francis Lin and Sean Cho, are teaching elders with experience in congregational leadership, denominational service, and innovative ministries. Francis serves as Presbytery leader of the Presbytery of Riverside and has held leadership roles at multiple General Assemblies as stated clerk of San Diego Presbytery. Sean serves as executive director of the Presbytery of San Diego and previously was the director of training for the 1001 New Worshiping Communities. They share a vision for a church rooted in belonging, becoming, and belovedness, and helping communities reimagine faithfulness in a changing world. Our last pair, Reverend Dr. Barbara Barkley, serves as pastor of Clayton Valley Presbyterian Church in Clayton, California, and Reverend Dr. William Bill Myers serves as pastor of First Presbyterian Church in Charleston, West Virginia. Both are currently active in their presbyteries, with Bill serving on the leadership team in the Presbytery of West Virginia, and Barbara serving on the Mission and Vision Leadership Committee, as well as the Standing Rules Implementation Team in the Presbytery of San Francisco. They both feel a strong call to listen across differences and help share stories. With that, we will go ahead and start with the predetermined questions. I'll be keeping time and trying to keep us to time. And we'll have an order. I'll call on pairs just because I know it can be difficult to popcorn on Zoom. But with that said, our first question is, what gifts, experiences, or convictions are driving your sense of call to the role of co-moderator, and how do you understand that role in this season of the church? And I'd like to ask Reverend Marta Pomeroy-Cordero and Chris Schottenmeyer to start us off.
Sure. I can go first. As a former middle school teacher, the classroom climate we created, the students and I together, was built on easing anxiety and increasing belonging that led to learning or flourishing. The priority for middle schoolers isn't about the content of your class, but the person that was in development. And receiving letters in the future from students that said, "Thank you for understanding what I was going through. I was having a really hard time in life," is the result of that, creating that climate. And as a ruling elder and now as a teaching elder, I love being a part of various teams and committees. My work on the border has been done in solidarity with faith groups and leaders here, and it connects me all across this country. And the connection and solidarity that's what brings me joy, especially when times are tough. This type of solidarity and connections, mutuality is important for the flourishing of our church. Chris?
Yeah, it is a joy to be able to be with you to talk about what I love about the church. The church in this season is called to be the leaves of the tree of life, agents of healing in a wounded and polarized world. And Marta and I believe that the PCUSA is being called to model that, to model compassion and courage to address injustice and genuine listening modeled in the way of Christ. And so my ministry and academic work have shaped that vision for me. I bring graduate work in leadership studies, which helps me think deeply about organizational systems and challenges facing institutions in changing times. I spent a lot of work in the intersection of compassion-based civil discourse in faith and politics, and how to have difficult conversations without dehumanizing one another. And so these experiences have taught me that leadership in the church today is about creating spaces where people can listen deeply and discern faithfully and seek healing together.
Thank you so much. I'll pass it to Reverend Francis Lin and Sean Cho for the next answer.
Thank you, Drew. I'll go first. So having the privilege of serving as a presbytery leader for a small presbytery, my sense of calling come from my people. We have a lot of churches in the desert where they're really small, less than 100 members, yet they are so faithful in doing the work that God had called them to do and serving the community that God had placed them in to do the work. And I am just inspired by them. And I understand that our world nowadays seems very polarized, yet I also feel like we need to spend more time talking about the amazing stories that people are doing, that God is doing with us. And so that's really what's driving me for this call to stand in as a co-moderator for the General Assembly. Sean?
Drew, it is great to talk to you again. We had a great conversation last month, and I feel the anxiousness, even just sitting here. It's not the anxiousness of this conversation, but just the anxiousness of the world. whether it was election night last night and all the different things that are going through it, that we live in an anxious society that overwhelms us in so many ways, that we've been talking about divisions in the church, divisions in society, divisions in everything. But we often look at the world as, and our society and our churches, that the glass is half empty, that we are missing things, and how do we restore things? But we need to look at it, the glass is half full, that God is doing amazing things in the world. And Francis and I spent the last 6 months just talking to people about what God's doing and the abundance of what God's doing. We look at around and see our memberships are dwindling, and we say, God, if you can just give us more people, or whatever it might be. But we are doing this because God's doing amazing things in our denomination, in the world, and we just want to talk about it.
Thank you both. I will pass it to Reverend Barkley and Myers for the next answer.
Okay, I'll begin. For me, the conviction that drove me to do this stand is that we truly are family to one another in Christ. That's what we are called to be, and yet we are more and more in situations where we're dividing ourselves into us and them, and not wanting to talk to or interact with the them at all. So my experiences towards bridging those differences, calling people in rather than out, calling them into greater circles of belonging, include that I'm part of a Spanish-speaking group of pastors in the Bay Area. By the way, I don't speak Spanish, but I'm trying really hard. But I show up even so, and my congregation has partnered with an African American congregation that we do a lot of stuff with. And we have done a series over the last few years of how to talk across the differences, where we invite people into our spaces. We do some training with them about how to listen to one another, and then we talk about hot topics like immigration and abortion, and in our area, rent control, because that's huge here in California. So I feel like I've also had mediation training, but all of those things together have really pushed me to want to work towards how do we talk across our differences, how do we include. Bill?
Sure. As I shared with the candidates earlier this afternoon, my grandchildren are children of color. My daughter is trans. I've seen what they've had to deal with in terms of the brokenness of our communities, even our churches, and how they've had to navigate those situations. I've also seen how diversity can bring people together and make our lives much richer. As a new church development pastor, I discovered, we're at our strongest when we are serving others, rather than trying to sustain ourselves. And then coming to West Virginia, I heard story after story of an extraordinary people, their resilience, the impact they've had on our state and our nation in terms of education, child welfare, worker safety, all those kinds of things. And that narrative gets lost in the larger national narrative when people think of West Virginia. So part of my sense of call is to share their stories. And recognizing that there are churches across our country, as I think Francis mentioned, that have similar stories. And these can be points of connection, crossing all sorts of barriers and boundaries as we try to stay together at the table.
Thank you both. And I will call on our last but not least pair, Reverend Luter and Chris Peters.
Okay, so I'll start. I think of the church as an ecosystem in a way of a tree, and that really comes from my first General Assembly that I attended was in 2016 in Portland, and I left there thinking, I have always heard people complain about General Assembly being top down, and what I really believe is that it's everyone coming together and being top out into the world and flourishing into the world. And as we come together, as the roots come together, we determine how we are going to flourish in the world. And having served as an internship during seminary in a church that was tiny, of 26 members in a rural community, and I served across ecumenical lines in the United Methodist Church in a church that was 3,500 members plus for 14 years. And then my current call is a church of about 150 members, and I've been there 12 years. I've I've grown to understand how to bring people together, how to listen, um, and it's really important that we learn to communicate with groups of people of all sizes, and build trust and transparency, and also make sure that we're looking to see what voices aren't getting heard, um, who's not at the table, who's about to leave the table, and how do we stop and say, we hear you and we're concerned that we maintain relationship. Um, I served on our local school board and served as chairperson in the fourth and fifth years of the new entity coming together as a board and as a school system, and learning how we are going to relate and respond to one another in transparency and honesty and love, and building trusting relationships was part of that work. Um, and as we come into a new structure, I think it's really important that we learn how we're going to function together, what our norms will be, and how they will come out of our values.
I'll jump in there. Rebecca mentioned trusting relationships, and for me, trusting relationships, meaningful connections are such at the core of what is great about being Presbyterian and what is good about being Presbyterian. And in my own life, I know that I would not be who I am if it wasn't for our church broadly, and the experiences I've had. The 2015, I think one of the Earth Care Award congregations was the church that I served prior to seminary, in a non-ordained position. And to have worked there as they were beginning to navigate what does it look like to care for not only our environment by creating such spaces as a garden space, but then also how do we care for our neighbors through that effort by providing then the fruits of that garden to local food banks and to folks in need. So for me, it's that kind of intersectionality of the important aspects of who we are as a church called to do justly in the world, but also who we are called to be through our own experiences. And I'm excited to see what's to use our language, emerging in this new season in the life of our denomination at the denominational level.
Thank you all. I will pose our second question that is maybe coming from both my demographic and my participation in Canopy, the Creation Action Network of Presbyterian Young Adults. This question is, how can the national church better cultivate meaningful participation of young adults, not only as attendees, but as decision makers, organizers, and leaders within the life of the church? I will pose this first to Francis and Sean.
Thank you, Drew. I am so privileged to serve a presbytery that really put their money where they say it's important. Last year, we sent one of the largest delegation to use Triennium, for which there's nothing to do with me. I came in, I inherited this, but I'm extremely proud how important this is for my people here. And I think it is critical to provide our young adults and our youth the opportunity to step up, not just to say, yes, we want you to step up, but actually put action into it and create that environment for them to participate. And that meaningful participation would be helpful for us all because we have to hand over our leadership at some point. And that I hope that is something as a denomination we take it very seriously. Sean?
For the longest time is in the church world, you sat there and you sat there for 20 years until someone invited you to become a deacon, then an elder, and then into the leadership of the church. But that doesn't happen very much anymore. Young adults have a strong sense of what is right and wrong, and they want to be involved in projects that are making a difference. They don't want to sit for 20 years in order to be an elder or a deacon, but they want to get, and they are passionate about things, whether it is earth care, or whether it's immigration or so forth. But we need to find ways to encourage them along their way to find those places where they can make a difference. And one of the questions I get asked a lot, I've been to so many general assemblies, but the young adult advisory delegates, well, why can't we just give them voting power? Well, we would love to do that, but part of it is our polity tells us that they need to be ruling elders in order to have the floor with presbytery. But what does that ultimately mean? Is that we need to have a flexible polity. I spent the last 4 long years on the task force for ordination standards as we really looked at the idea of what does a flexible polity mean, and how do we hold rigid to some standards but flexible in others? And I think in order as we move forward into inviting young adults is that we are simply caretakers for the next generation in our roles, and to invite people, young adults, to take the spots behind us, as well as create the spaces for them to take that leadership.
Thank you both. I will pass it now to Reverend Barkley and Reverend Myers.
Drew, you and Emma and so many of us around this table already know that young adults are deeply committed to issues, community building, environmental stewardship, racial justice, hunger, global mission. The question is whether the church is willing to trust them with leadership. One lesson I've learned as an organizing pastor is that for people to become leaders, they have to be given opportunities to lead. We often wait until someone is fully prepared before giving them responsibility. In reality, responsibility is often what develops leadership. The church also needs to connect leadership with meaningful mission. Young adults are often less interested in maintaining institutions and more interested in making a difference. That's not a problem to solve, it's an opportunity to embrace. Young adults don't simply need a seat at the table. They need a voice that matters once they get there.
Yeah, I'm totally on board with everything that Bill said there. I think that we need to give them vote as well as voice, like on the floor of the General Assembly. I also feel that one part of empowering our young people is allowing them to be part of the agenda setting. That is not something that we generally do. We set the agenda, even if we invite them in, we set the agenda. They need to be part of setting the agenda. We need to ask what appeals to them, what matters to them. And as you know, our youth do tend to be much more aware of the climate crisis we're in, and that is really important. They have a lot to teach us, a lot for us to learn from them.
Thank you both. Next, we have Reverend Luter and Reverend Peters.
Sure. Excuse me. I have served in non-ordained campus ministry internships. I've walked in a lot of spaces working in youth and young adult ministry throughout my career at this point. And I think one of the biggest thing we need to do is to use different language than what we've heard before. Coming out of the growing young concept is handing off the keys in the work that we do to folks who sometimes, as we've heard already, have not had the keys handed off to them for various reasons, whether it's polity or lack of trust or other folks from other generations clinging to the keys. And in my experience working with places like co-directing at Montreat Youth Conference and some of those spaces, Massanetta, I think one of the biggest things we can do is partnership and accompanying one another across generations to work together, lifting voices and being heard equally and valuing that is crucial to me.
I would agree with listening and creating opportunities. I think offering resources is really important as well for creating opportunities like Canopy for young adults to find the places that really matter to them, their places of passion. Most young adults are not interested in serving on a committee to maintain an institution, but they are interested in spending their time making a difference in the world. I just had a conversation yesterday with my 21-year-old about the planet, and honestly, he teaches me things, and it's important for us to recognize that our children can teach us things and make space for them to have the opportunity to share and to lead and to have groups that are not defined by you have to be asked to serve here.
Thank you both. And last but not least, we have Reverend Pomeroy Cordero and Reverend Schonenmeyer.
Chris, you can go first on this one.
I'll say I agree with much of what you've heard tonight, and these are wonderful colleagues to stand with. But I think I might have the privilege of saying that I'm the youngest one in this group of candidates who are standing, and I can tell you that young adults don't simply want to inherit institutions. They want to participate in meaningful mission, authentic community, real leadership. And I've met a lot of older leaders who like to say, youth and young adults are the future of the church, and or that they're not just the future, they're the church today. And all of that is true, but then those older leaders refuse to let go of actual power, or they control the processes of discernment and decision making. And Marta and I both bring experience serving with young people throughout our careers. If we want younger generations to be the future of this church that we love, then we must trust them to lead the church today, or they'll simply find other ways to be the church while the denomination that we love continues to decline. And a 75-year-old saint of the church once told me that it is his spiritual gift at that stage of life to intentionally step aside and let younger leaders lead. And, if we want young people to lead, then we must be willing to not only welcome them into the room, but let them rearrange the furniture.
And I too agree with a lot of what everybody is saying about how to invite youth in. And I travel around doing pulpit supply, substitute preaching, for those of you who are not familiar with that term. And many times there are congregations that I'm familiar with, and a parent will say, I'm so sorry that so-and-so isn't here. They have whatever activity it is they have going on. My response to them always is, oh, they're glorifying God today by whatever it is that they're doing. As a former middle school teacher and youth leader, participation engagements matter, and it means meeting them where they're at, taking the time to listen, to nurture, and to empower, like people were saying, give them opportunities and involvement and inclusion with the intent to lessen anxiety and fear. So getting their participation includes building in that part and creating places of comfort and acceptance. They have gifts that need to be nurtured by congregations, and we know this happens in relationships. I think churches having intergenerational relationships is a gift that the church is giving to all of us. And having these important relationships are what keeps youth grounded, hopeful, and, to be honest, with issues like suicide, escapism, and depression, radicalization. These relationships, the relationships that our churches are providing, are keeping youth alive, involved, and flourishing in this world.
Thank you all. And maybe moving on to my other involvement with PEC and the other host of this talk, Presbyterians for Earth Care. Our next question is centered on creation justice. How do you believe the PCUSA is being called to respond to the climate crisis and broader creation justice concerns? And what role do you see spiritual leadership playing in that witness? And first, I'd like to welcome Reverend Barkley and Reverend Myers to take this question.
Yeah, thank you. I absolutely love this question because I feel very strongly that God calls us to be stewards of the earth, not users of the earth, not abusers of the earth, that all creation is made in the image of God and that we are deeply connected. So when any of us are being harmed or lessened, all of us are being harmed or lessened, and that includes the earth and all creation as part of that. Again, deeply believe that we are all God's image. I have to admit that my favorite author is Robin Wall Kimmerer, and her book Braiding Sweetgrass has informed a lot of how I talk about this, that she talks about mutuality and reciprocity with the earth, that we should be giving to the earth as much as we take. We should take care of and serve the earth as much as we allow the earth to serve us. And I realize that's a very different practice, but it's one I try with my own garden when I'm out there talking to my plants. I love gardening. It's my favorite hobby. And our church also has a community garden, and we too are an earth care congregation. Bill?
Drew, as the dinosaur in the group, I guess it's appropriate for me to talk about fossil fuels in West Virginia. But serving in West Virginia has taught me that creation care is never just about the environment. It's also about communities, livelihoods, dignity. Coal helped power this nation and sustain generations of families. At the same time, many communities continue to live with the environmental and economic consequences tied to extraction. Those realities must be held together honestly. What gives me hope is that we are seeing new possibilities emerge. Organizations like Coalfield Development are combining workforce development, environmental restoration, and economic opportunity. Companies like Solar Holler are demonstrating that renewable energy can create local jobs. At the same time, we're facing new challenges. Data centers, artificial intelligence, and expanding digital infrastructure require enormous amounts of energy and water. These developments force us to ask not only what is profitable or technologically possible, but what is sustainable and just. Spiritual leadership helps us ask those deeper questions. Every generation receives new technologies. The church's responsibility is to ask whether those technologies serve the flourishing of people, communities, and creation in a just way.
Thank you so much. Next, I'd like to welcome Reverend Luter and Reverend Peters.
So I mentioned that General Assembly to me is a coming together and a top-out experience. One of those places is MRTI and the ability that we have to sit at tables and influence decisions of corporations around issues of sustainability and responsibility for the health of creation. And we at the same time are able to create grassroots momentum to lift up ways that individuals and congregations can care for creation in their daily lives. And I'd really like to see part of our spiritual leadership playing a part in witness is to give individuals and congregations more resources for, or more pre-made resources for sharing on social media the work and the ways that we can care for the planet, encouraging others to join them in sustainable practices. I'm a hands in the dirt kind of person, and so I really enjoy being able to connect with people around how do we care for our soil, how do we care for I'm big on not having mosquitoes and all of our other pollinators killed. I spend a lot of time on that, but I think some of those fact sheets and things like that being broken down in things that are social media shareability is important.
I think part of what we're called to do as Presbyterians is to live into that sense of wonder, into at God's creation and the way that it inspires us to movement within our lives, and to do things like be gardeners in our own spaces, but then within the councils of the church to wonder about the questions of our impact and what impacts we're called to have. We're certainly mindful of the grassroots level as pastors ourselves, and so my own congregation emphasizing native plants on our property and how we use our facilities, but all of those areas of the Earth Care Pledge for worship, education, facilities, and outreach, I think should be questioned at all levels in councils of the church.
Thank you both. Next, I'd like to welcome Reverend Pomeroy Cordero and Reverend Schonenmeyer into this question.
Well, I've experienced climate crisis in my community multiple times, from a devastating flood of 2008 in Cedar Rapids to a derecho in 2020 that took away 70% of my community's tree canopy was gone. So I know the feeling of coming out of a basement to see the devastation all around you. And as steward of God's glorious creation, we are to not just heal relationships with each other, but also our connection to the resources and land around us. being present in prayers and action for those who are affected by climate crisis and what I consider unnatural disasters is important, and raise awareness of the issues and impact that have long-lasting effects on communities. We should advocate for policies that center those who are most affected and those who are displaced. As a TSAT, I served on the Environmental Justice Committee in a General Assembly, and I applaud the Synod of the Sun that I'm a part of for having a director for disaster recovery. And I lift up the work of PDA that has been on inaction, and I work for changing these systems before we have to be reactive to them. We want to be proactive. Chris?
Yeah, so I would just say that caring for creation is a spiritual and moral calling rooted in our belief that the earth belongs to God and that we are entrusted to care for it with humility. The climate crisis is already impacting communities, as we've talked about, through flooding and displacement and inequalities that fall hardest on the most vulnerable. You know, where I serve along the Mississippi River, I have watched the floodwaters rise again and again. And one conversation that stays with me was with a member of my community whom I disagree with on pretty much every political issue imaginable. And yet we both stood there talking about the water covering places that did not used to flood this way. And in moments like that, the labels in our political realm matter less than the shared realities facing our communities. You know, the PCSA is being called to respond with faithful witness, caring for neighbors, telling the truth about suffering, reminding people that stewardship of creation is ultimately an act of love. And so we need to be talking not just about what we divest from in terms of polity, you know, our investments, but we need to be talking about what we're actually investing in. How are we investing in things that are going to lead to celebrate a just transition, reduce harm, and build a broad kind of moral momentum in the life of our denomination?
Thank you both. And last but not least, I'd like to welcome Reverend Lynn and Reverend Cho into this question.
Well, so last time I checked, I think we only have one Earth, right? So you tell me that's not important. It's extremely important, not just for us today, but it's also extremely important for our next generation. And living in California, we deal with all kinds of stuff. We have fire, we had all kinds of, you know, pollutions, and so that's a daily thing that we deal with. But I am extremely proud of a denomination like ours, like PCUSA, that will bring matters like this to General Assembly every 2 years. And I've seen our churches and our people being faithful, trying to care the best, being a good steward to the resources that's given to us by God. And I feel it's not just it is, of course, a spiritual discipline that we need to continue to cultivate, right? Not just being a good steward, but what does it mean? What is God saying to us during this time? How do we care for something that we really didn't have anything to do with? God created those things for us to be good steward of. Sean?
Spiritual leadership is more than just us saying that it's wrong, a group of us, but it's how do we bring people along and talk about it in our congregations, in their everyday lives, that it isn't just separating the recycling from the rest of the trash, but it's more than that. It is talking about how it impacts our faith. And what does that mean for us as a denomination? It means bringing people along and helping teaching them what's going on in congregations, in Sunday school classrooms, and really seeing why this is important. Francis and I talk about a lot, it's about becoming. It's a transformational thing as we become more and more like the people that God calls us to be. And ultimately is that we're all God's children and that we need to care for God's creation for all God's people.
Well, thank you all for your answers on that question. I will move to our final predetermined question, pre-shared question, and encourage the audience to continue to look at that link Emma shared in the chat. Submit your questions and upvote the ones you want to hear most answered. But for our last question, I'd like to ask, at a time of war, displacement, and profound human suffering in places like Gaza, Sudan, Ukraine, Iran, and elsewhere, what roles should co-moderators and the wider church play in speaking to violence, peace, and human dignity? I'd like to pass this first to Reverend Luter and Reverend Peters.
I really think that it comes down to seeing the image of God in every person and helping others see the image of God in every person. We have a tendency to um, generalize and think of groups of people without realizing the stories and the individuals who are being impacted. As co-moderators, we are ambassadors of the General Assembly, sharing the ways that the Spirit is working and helping people hear the stories of one another and sitting in at tables with people, help people together, ultimately to speak to the world about what shalom, peace looks, um, calling for an end to violence and for us to live in peace. My goal as a co-moderator will always be to respect others and to seek peace in every way.
I mean, I think in the context of this call, there's no question that in places of such violence, there's a deep intersectionality with how it impacts the environment, whether it be through famine or erosion due to violent acts. I think there's no question that, in my mind at least, that co-moderators should be called to speak against violence in all of its forms, but also to be able to personally speak to the concept of the flourishing of all people and what that means within the life of our faith, whether it's from Barthian theology or feminist theology, to be able to lift that concept up and name that we are called to seek the flourishing of all people, whether that's through peace and shalom or whether that's through walking alongside one another as we do disaster relief, or as we walk alongside one another as we seek to restore and to value the gift of God's creation. So I think that image of flourishing as a co-moderator for me would be one that would stand out in all of those different spheres, but particularly as we consider what it means to care for people and to seek peace.
Thank you both. Next, I'd like to welcome Rev. Pomeroy Cordero and Reverend Schottenmeier to answer this question.
Go ahead, Chris.
I'll just share, I come at this as a local church pastor. I walk beside people every day through conflict and grief, helping communities seek hope and transformation. A community where, it's multiple times a year the police are at our church asking to see our cameras because there was another shooting in our neighborhood. So violence is very real. During the Lenten season, I was actually talking with members of my congregation, reflecting on suffering across the world. Someone mentioned what's happening in Gaza. Another spoke about the Ukraine. And then someone kind of quietly asked, well, what about the Sudan? And the conversation just kind of fell silent for a moment under the weight of so much human suffering in our world. And at a time when, a time of war and displacement and violence, I believe the co-moderators and I think the wider church are called to bear witness to the dignity of every person created in the image of God. Whether in Gaza or Sudan or in Ukraine or Iran or elsewhere, the church must move the conversation past political talking points and partisan categories, because we are called to see people before positions. And so that means that the church cannot remain silent in the face of injustice and dehumanization. The church must speak clearly for peace and human dignity and compassion. Because in a wounded and divided world, the church is called truly to be the leaves of healing, agents of Christ's presence wherever we go.
Serving at the border, there have been times where I've seen human suffering up close, but not to the level of those experiencing the devastation of ongoing war. And having traveled to Palestine and Israel in January of 2024 as part of my seminary experience, and knowing and seeing checkpoints and the militarization at the time, I can see the comparisons here and how it starts with dehumanization. We as Christians are called to speak out against atrocities and be as present as we can in accompaniment and advocacy. And I am grateful for the Presbyterian Office of Public Witness, who boldly shares statements, because we are peacemakers, seekers, and peace builders.
Thank you both. Next, I would like to welcome Reverend Lynn and Reverend Cho.
So Sean and I have been talking recently with just a lot of people, and one of the story that really resonated with me greatly is the one that from the Reverend Raphael. He spoke about how one of his members from his church, they're mostly Hispanic speaking congregation, and was detained by the ICE. And so he was Reverend Raphael was the first one to actually welcome this person to come into this country. And so when he was detained, um, the Reverend Raphael is also the first person that this detainee got to see. And I think that's extremely important for us to show up, to be present with people. We can sit back and say, well, we're there with you, but how do we continue to show up and have a presence with people who are suffering? And that's regardless wherever we can. We may not all be able to go to Gaza. We may not be able to go to Sudan, but how do we communicate that we are with you? And I think that's part of our calling is to, that's our calling. That's our highest calling from Christ, to be with people as Christ has always been with the people. Sean?
During the Artemis 2 mission, they were taking a photo back at Earth, and Neil deGrasse Tyson talked about it as being the cosmic view of the Earth and how it should drastically change how we view the world. Because as they looked back at the Earth, it had no political divisions, it had no nothing. It was all one world. And oftentimes we think of it as ourselves as the United States, Mexico, and wherever it might be, how we've separated ourselves, but we've missed the actual point is that we're all the children of God, and that we're all beloved by God. And as looking at that, we need to stand with the people in South Sudan, Gaza, wherever it might be, because we're all the beloved children of God.
Thank you both. And last but not least, I will pass it to Reverend Barkley and Reverend Myers.
Go ahead, Barbara.
Okay. So I deeply believe in our denomination's adoption of being Matthew 25 church. Deeply believe that we are called to care for the least of these, and to me that includes not just those people in our community who we oppress, but people around the world who are suffering from violence. I also very strongly believe that if we spent a tenth the amount of time working on how to talk to each other and learn from each other as we do creating new ways to kill each other, that there would no longer be war. So I feel like our job is to follow Jesus, and Jesus' call is to love our enemies and to therefore include them and work with them and talk to them rather than killing them. I totally agree with Francis about, what we need to do is listen to each other's stories and lift those stories up, because it is in the sharing of those stories that I believe we will come to understand the damage that we do by supporting or allowing violence to happen in the world. Okay, I know I got passionate there, but Bill, your turn.
Drew, the church can't stop every war, but it can refuse to become indifferent to suffering. Whether we're speaking about Gaza, Israel, Lebanon, Sudan, Ukraine, Iran, or other places experiencing violence, our starting point must be the conviction, I think as Pastor Luter also said, that every human being bears the image of God. Co-moderators should help the church maintain a consistent moral witness, mourning suffering wherever it occurs, advocating for peace, and refusing to reduce people to political categories or national identities. One of the dangers of our moment is that we can become highly attentive to some suffering while overlooking other suffering. The church is called to something different. We're called to see our neighbors wherever they're found and to stand with those who are vulnerable. The church's credibility depends not on whose side we take, but on whether people can see Christ's compassion in our witness.
Well, thank you all for those questions and your reflection on all of that going into this discussion. Now we'll pivot to the questions the audience has been submitting and voting on leading up and during this talk. And piggybacking on this last question, the question with the most upvotes in our Q&A is, What is the theological imperative for the Peace USA to pursue justice for Palestinians, and what urgent steps should the church take to end the genocide? I will pass that first to Reverend Pomeroy Cordero and Schaudenmeyer.
Chris, I'm going to let you go first.
What a difficult situation, and I think it's important to name that what's happening in with the Palestinian people is just an atrocity. It is genocide. It is wrong, and to stand with and for the people of Palestine does not mean that one is engaging in anti-Semitic, thinking. Certainly, we can hold value for all people while naming that the modern state of Israel is engaging in just a deep atrocity against the Palestinian people. The imperative that the PCUSA has in this moment is truly just to speak that truth, to name that as people of faith, as people that come from the Abrahamic religions, that we are called to be siblings in this great big world. I mean, as Sean was sharing that commentary from Neil deGrasse Tyson, that we often like to separate ourselves, but it is deeply important for us as people of faith to name injustice when we see it. And what's happening to the Palestinian people is an injustice, and the church is called to speak that truth.
And I think a lot of it comes with coming outside of the Presbyterian Church and joining with other denominations, other interfaith groups, ecumenical groups to speak out against these atrocities as well. I'm part of a Free Families group that talks about families that are in detention, and we sing songs and we pray together. And there's also many songs that are created from people who are trying to free Palestine and pray for the children that are suffering there as well. So this solidarity with those who are doing this work.
Thank you both. Reverend Lynn and Cho, would you like to take this question?
Sure. Having moderated the Interfaith and Ecumenical Committee at the General Assembly 4 years ago, I am really proud of a denomination that we have taken a stance against the suffering of people, especially in Palestinian territory. And so I feel as a co-moderator, that is where we will continue to encourage open dialogue because context is extremely important. There are tons of stories, and what we got may be just a sliver of it. How do we really continue to have conversation with each other? And I think that's where we need to do in order to get us to the point where we can sit down and talk with each other in ways that we can come together and do what we're called to do, which to recognize that we are all beloved creation of God. We are beloved children of God. Sean?
As we talk about dehumanizing, when we just talk about Gaza, we just think of certain things, but we forget that there's Christian Palestinians there, there's Islamic, there's women, children, and the list goes on, that we dehumanize a whole people group by this, and we forget that they are all the children of God, as Francis says. We've dehumanized them, and I am against in dehumanizing of people everywhere, whether it's in the United States, and I'm for justice, much as like Micah 6:8 says, it's about justice and mercy and living humbly with our God. And we as co-moderators, as a denomination, need to stand with those that are in harm's way.
Thank you both. Next, I would ask Reverend Barkley and Reverend Myers to answer this question.
Bill, you want to start?
Sure. Drew, I tend to draw a distinction between the leaders and the peoples. I think the world community needs to investigate the leaders of Israel, the United States, Hamas. Uh, Countless people have made themselves wealthy on the suffering of both the Palestinians and the people of Israel. And so I think those folks need to be held accountable. We need to find out answers and seek justice on behalf of both peoples. From my perspective, the only hope for peace that we have is to recognize that the tears of the Palestinian people and the tears of the Israeli people and so many others in the region are all coming from the same well of grief.
So for me, my congregation actually is the one that brought the embargo overture to the to San Francisco Presbytery that will now go to GA. I think that we do need to take a stand against genocide. Lobbying is important. Naming the genocide is important, but conversation is also essential because, again, if we fail to tell the stories, people just entrench and they don't move. So we have to keep telling the stories and sharing what we've experienced.
Thank you both. And lastly, I'd like to welcome Reverend Luter and Reverend Peters to answer this question.
I think a lot of great things have been said, and to piggyback on some of that, I think we are called to live into the statements that we have made, to lean into the spaces of education within our denomination, such as that advocacy hour, such as statements that we can make, movements toward other types of divestment, looking at other overtures in the future. Those are all important aspects. I think there's also that grassroots kind of congregational level education that needs to happen for the folks who don't really understand or don't really follow along, who may equate one nation state with a certain blessing or a certain understanding, and to do that work as well. So there's a lot of different levels, and I think we're called to walk alongside ecumenical partners within this conversation and to do our best to name and frame in a way that is healthy to call out genocide and to call out atrocities.
Yeah, I agree with what Chris said about education and using our polity to bring forward new work to create opportunities to impact the world. I also think that it's really important for us to encourage at all levels of the church the opportunity to create partnerships and to share stories, to talk about the family in Bethlehem that I had dinner with in 2019 and how I pray for them and worry about them because I don't know how they are. To talk about what the checkpoints are like and what time in the morning a Palestinian has to get up to get to the checkpoint to get across for their job. To talk about the fact that they can't drive a car into Israeli areas. And then to talk about what's happening now, and to give opportunities for people to lament and pray, but also be aware beyond Israel has bombed Lebanon. A few weeks ago, my husband came home and one of his students apologized for being less focused. And he said, I got a call this morning. Our family has moved into the mountains in Lebanon. And I just am worried about them. And listening and hearing and sharing those stories, I think, is how we move people to come back to the table and talk and work through to peace.
Thank you all for your answers to that question. Next, I would like to move to the question that received the second most votes in our poll, and that is, what item of business coming before the General Assembly would you say you are tracking most closely? I will pass that first to Reverend Lynn and Cho.
Well, obviously, we are all commissioners this year. And so I am tracking the most my committee, which is Reform Identity within U.S. And I think it'll be very interesting to kind of have dialogues with my other commissioners regarding all the business for that committee. And I'm also tracking very closely all the other piece of business coming on to the General Assembly floor. However, I know as a commissioner, my primary responsibility as a commissioner is really well versed myself in the overtures coming to that committee. So shout out to Russ. And I believe Chris is on that same committee with me, right?
I am.
You got
Looking
both
forward to
Chris's apparently.
Oh, really?
Everybody, all the cool kids apparently are on that committee.
What can I say? What can I say?
So what I'm tracking is I was on the task force for ordination standards for the last 4 years, and 2 years ago I was the resource person for the committee to General Assembly and answering all those questions. So one of the things personally that I'm tracking is that, because we spent a lot of time on adaptive changes, trying to figure out how the process of ordination, what ordination is, commission ruling elders, and how do we give people that don't have voice, such as new worshiping community leaders, voice in the PCUSA.
Thank you both. I will pass it to Reverend Barkley and Peters for this question.
Or maybe Myers?
Yes, indeed.
That's all right. Barbara, do you want to go or do you want me?
You can go. It's fine.
All right. As Francis said, I'm really tracking my committee most closely, racial justice. But to be honest, there's some fascinating things out there. I will admit, having gone through so many decades of other sexuality questions, I thought we'd be in the clear, but polyamory has caught my attention, and I'm trying to wrap my head around it. But I think there are a lot of important issues in front of the General Assembly, and as moderators, we have to take a balanced approach to all of them, because we have to be able to communicate to the larger church and perhaps even the nation and beyond, what our church is saying on all of these issues, not just ones that are closest to our heart. So trying to keep it balanced, but racial justice is where my focus is.
And I would add that similarly, as everyone has said, we go first as commissioners, and I've been put on the committee I was least interested in, which is the Financial Stewardship and Witness Committee, which is very valuable stuff, but it's the committee I was honestly least interested in. But because that is my committee, I'm really trying to do a deep dive into those things. I do want to add, and Bill's said this, but to say it a little differently, if we do become co-moderators, it's really our job to be advocates for the denomination and to empower the voices of other people, rather than stating even how we feel about these things. Again, we're supposed to be representatives and ambassadors for the denomination. So for me, it's I'm listening deeply.
Thank you both. I will now welcome Reverend Peters and Reverend Luter into this question.
So I'm on the Racial Action Committee, so I have read all of those parts and pieces and the links that are contained therein, and spent a lot of time in prayer and preparation there. I am probably most interested in the overtures that are related to world mission, because I do believe so much in that General Assembly is a time for us to come together and show who we are and who we are called to be to the world. And world mission is one of the ways that we do that. And so how we move forward in that space is important to me. But as others have said, our work as co-moderators, if we prevail, is to be the voice that shares with others the spirit that was present in the room at General Assembly as decisions were made, and helping people hear and understand how the Spirit moved and might be moving us forward is our work.
Thank you all. And lastly, I would like to
Okay.
Oh, sorry, Chris, go for
That's
it.
all right. I don't have to say anything. I'll be quick. I did get excited when I heard Francis say the name Chris, and I wasn't paying attention to the name of the committee. I am actually serving on theological education and ordination, and one of the overtures there that I'm very interested in is the overture that speaks to collaboration within different levels of or different types of ministries to empower ruling elder ministry and to consider what ordination looks like there. I also want to note that I was asked by our Green team, Green at Heart at Westminster, to give a presentation on the overtures that were being brought forth within that environmental committee. And one that I think is really interesting is that Green Fund possibility and the ability for the possible future of the foundation to seed work that will make a difference for climate justice and climate action. I thought that was a really just interesting possibility, and that's one I'm personally following that kind of connects with this area.
Thank you both. And lastly, I'll welcome Reverend Pomeroy Cordero and Reverend Schottenmeyer into this.
I'm on the Constitutional Interpretation Committee, so I am the one who gets to be in committee, talk about that monogamy overture. So I'm curious to see where it's going to go and where the Spirit will lead. Within my committee, I'm also curious about the non-disclosure agreements and the defining of sexual misconduct versus just misconduct. So all of the overtures within my committee are interesting, and I'm curious to see where the Spirit will lead on them. I echo the curiosity about where we're going with mission and world mission, and I'm very I think there's opportunity for healing within our denomination when it comes to that. So I would love to see the Holy Spirit working through us and working through those overtures to see where we'll go next. Chris?
Yeah, so I would say there are a couple of. I mean, there isn't just one that I'm watching. As you know, my colleagues have shared, our job as those who are standing for co-moderator in this context. That's how we're presenting ourselves to you and to the church. And so we, have to be cautious about how we respond to particular things. But I will say that it is a little serendipitous that I get to be on the Reformed Identity in the United States committee. My background studying the intersection of religion and public policy. I really do think, and this one of the reasons that Marta and I are here today, one of the biggest things facing not just the church, but our nation is Christian nationalism and how we respond in this time. And so I am paying very close attention to what will happen with those overtures and how we as a church speak prophetically in this moment. And Marta and I, if we were to prevail, look forward to opportunities to travel around the denomination and speak with one voice on behalf of the church in this particular moment around that. I would be remiss if I didn't say that I'm also paying attention. There are some overtures coming regarding boundary training and abuse prevention training that are coming to sort of seek to clarify some of the current language that's in the Book of Order. I served on the Survivors of Sexual Misconduct Task Force. I am a survivor of clergy sexual abuse that occurred in my youth in this denomination, and so I love being Presbyterian, but I also know the deep pain that happens in this denomination and how leaders have placed children and youth in vulnerable situations over and over again. I have heard, not as after I came forward at the 2016 General Assembly, I have had many people in this denomination reach out to me to share their stories, and I hope that the way we clarify that language doesn't remove certain language, that we make very clear that child sexual abuse prevention training is essential for the life of this denomination.
Well, thank you all. In the interest of time, I'm going to move now to closing statements. Please try to keep these to 2 minutes each, and I'll pass it to Reverend Barkley and Reverend Myers for the first one.
Well, you want to start?
Okay. The Earth Care Pledge reminds us that creation care is not a political project, but a discipleship commitment. Whether we're talking about coal communities, renewable energy, artificial intelligence, data centers, or public policy, the question before the church remains the same. How do we love God, love our neighbors, and steward the gifts entrusted to us? Those responsibilities belong together, and faithful leadership requires us to hold them together. One thing I appreciate about organizations like PEC and Canopy is that they remind the church that creation care is not only about environmental policy, it's also about discipleship, leadership, and the future we're leaving to the next generation. In West Virginia, those questions become very concrete. We see communities shaped by coal, communities exploring renewable energy, and now growing conversations around data centers and energy demand. The challenge is learning how to care for both creation and people without treating those concerns as competitors.
So I would just say that, again, our job is going to be whatever, even if we don't become, co-moderators. I think all of us who are standing, our job is to empower the stories in the church. Our job is to help share the stories of those who have been silenced for too long. Our job is to mediate at times rather than it is to push our own agendas. And I think in doing that, we open up space for the Spirit to enable people to hear each other and hopefully grow from each other, hopefully learn from each other. And I just want to say I'm grateful to all of those who are standing, as well as for Canopy and PEC and all of those who are working for justice and care.
Thank you both. I'll welcome Reverend Luter and Reverend Peters to give us their closing remarks.
So our logo and our motto is prepare to emerge, and it's a chrysalis. And we are in a time where Presbyterians are restructuring. Presbyterian life and witness is emerging, and new connections are being made and new norms are being set. And I believe that we have the opportunity to go from being a caterpillar of an organization and don't get me wrong, I love caterpillars. I love their little fur. I love how they move. I love how they feel on my hand, but they're also too heavy to fly and they move really slowly. And we are going through a complete metamorphosis. And I hope and pray and believe that we will come through this to be a lighter and stronger organization. It's more nimble, that can fly, that connect the flowers, the grassroots, and pollinate ministries across blossom. And time in a chrysalis is hard. And so I believe that it really is the role of the co-moderator to cast a vision of preparing to emerge transformed in a way that is whole and transformational.
And thinking about that concept of transformation, for me, part of our transformation as people needs to be to lean into our understanding of what it means to respond to God's grace as people of gratitude, rather than people of being the frozen chosen or whatever term you want to lean on to. That sense of gratitude for the goodness of God's creation, which is the response that we see through folks at PEC and Canopy. We see that sense of wonder. I've washed feet on the rim of the Grand Canyon, and to take the spaces of creation and to enter into them with a sense of wonder and gratitude, but also leaning into our worship and who we are as Presbyterians is an important concept for me. Rebecca is great with metaphors, and one that she is also named that I love is for us as moderators to be pollinators within the church and pollinators within that ambassador role between this General Assembly and the next General Assembly, moving throughout the church to share the good. And as people who lean into that concept of gratitude, at least in my understanding, we would be people who lean on the goodness of God and all that God brings into our lives through creation, through relationships, and through the goodness of the best of who we are as Presbyterians.
Thank you for those words, and I'll welcome Reverend Pomeroy Cordero and Reverend Schottenmeier to give us their closing remarks.
Chris, go ahead.
So I have a confession. I will share that much of the wisdom that I have as a pastor, and I do come at this role as a local church pastor. I'm not an institutional person, but much of the wisdom that I have as a pastor comes from my children. I remember years ago when I was I had to go to the doctor because I'd hurt my ankle, and I had to either I was going to have surgery or I was going to have to wear one of them big goofy boots for like 2 months. And I didn't have time to recover from surgery, and so the boot it was, and I was huffing and puffing all the way home because I did not want to wear this boot. And I get home and I go into my home office and I start working on whatever church stuff I was working on. And my son, he was about 2 years old at the time, and he comes walking into my home office wearing one black snow boot. And he walks in, I'm like, buddy, what are you doing? And he goes, see, Dad, now we both have boots and we can walk together. That's the job of co-moderators, is to see to listen to the hearts of the people in the church, and at the local church level, to hear their stories and to walk together. That is what Marta and I have been discerning. We have been discerning since about January of 2025, actually, this sense of call to stand for co-moderators, and we immediately latched on to one of my favorite passages from Revelation 22. To be the leaves of the tree of life for the healing of the nations. And that was months before we found out that was going to be the passage to guide this General Assembly. We as candidates for co-moderator really do desire to walk together with the church.
Yeah, and walking together is what we're doing. Chris and I have been walking together for a while, like you said, and I know Chris has experience with comedy. And before I went to seminary, I was part of a local storytelling troupe, not even knowing at the time that I would be going into ministry and trusting in the Holy Spirit to send me somewhere else or somewhere next. And telling the story of the church's life, especially when it comes to earth care, resonates with me because I know the power of storytelling to transform congregations, communities, and Chris and I are grateful to God to be part of the story of this General Assembly. And with those of you who are participating in this webinar and standing alongside us, and we are grateful for this and this story. And we are full of hope for healing and want us all to be the leaves because we are meant for this type of healing.
Thank you both. Next, I would like to welcome Reverend Lynn and Reverend Cho.
Certainly. I'm going to quote our current co-moderator, Cece Armstrong. She likes to say, I love you all, and there's nothing you can do about it. And that is how I feel. I am super grateful for a denomination that gives me the opportunity to not just be a member, not just come to the table, but belong to this bigger thing that I can ever imagine. And so for that, I'm forever grateful. I'm forever grateful for everyone here today talking with us, and for all of you who are participating and listening. As the co-moderators, if elected, I will try to be faithful to those people who elected me to be the co-moderator, right? I would want to represent them, whatever they voted, that I will carry out their vision and their votes to the best of my ability. Sean?
This group talks about ecology and justice as something that we should strive for, which is completely what we strive for. But in the midst of it, there's some great pain in it, that what is going on in our world, and whether it's microplastics or whatever it might be, there's so much pain. But how do we hold on to this pain of what is going on? That we're fighting because God's calling us to do something and to be a part of something, to fight for justice and what is going on. But God, through it all, God is moving. Even though we feel sometimes the mountains coming down on us, God continues to move, because God is not absent in the midst of this all, but God is continually moving through this all. And Francis and I want to tell stories, but it's not just telling stories, but it's also lifting up those stories of those that are marginalized, that are in diaspora, and those that are left behind, because those stories are vital to who we are as people of God.
Well, thank you all, and thank you to all the candidates for joining us tonight. We really appreciate you giving your time this evening and for discerning your call, and look forward to seeing more of you in the lead up and during GA. I'll let Emma share a few resources we have for PEC and Canopy, along with some of the overtures Presbyterians for Earth Care and Canopy are supporting going into the assembly. And please feel free, candidates, if you have a website or anything you want to share for your for folks to keep up to date with you as well, please feel free to put that in the chat as well. But we look forward to seeing more of you, and thank you everybody for joining this evening.
Drew, thanks for pulling this all together. I would love to send us out with a prayer, and you can post while I'm praying if you want to. That's fine. Creator God, we ask your blessing on this gathering, on the people gathered, the congregations represented, and God, on the determination of the mission of your church among these people standing for co-moderator. We're grateful for the energy, intelligence, imagination, and love of these folks, and we ask your blessing on each one of us as we go out into the world to be your heart and mind, hands and feet, to be the people that you have called us to be. We thank you for your presence with us tonight. We pray all this in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.
Thank you all. It was great to be with you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you.
Grace and peace.
Hi. So if anyone would like to participate